Good morning and welcome to this online webinar, a roundtable discussion from the NLA Cities Forum. I'm Greg Clark, a senior advisor at NLA, and I'll be your host for today's event. Our subject is reimagining cities. We're building upon the experience of Paris, who since 2014 have been leading the Reinventing Paris project. We have guests from Barcelona and from Oslo who've been reinventing and reimagining their cities. And of course, just this year, as part of the new London agenda, NLA introduced the Reimagine London project, which we'll hear about shortly. The format will be very simple. We'll have an introduction shortly from Benjamin O'Connor at the NLA. I'll then introduce Phil Graham, Barbara Ponskaina, and Oyvind Satvet to set the scene. And then I'll have a conversation with them involving also Stephen Barrett from RSHP, talking about how and why we need to reimagine our cities. Thank you for joining us. Please use the chat function on Zoom to share your thoughts and also to share questions, and we'll try to introduce those into the discussion. And I'll hand over now to Benjamin to introduce the Reimagine London project. Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and hello, everyone. I'm used to being the chair of these, so I'm not used to presenting, but this is quite nice for me. Yes, good morning, everybody. Hopefully, a number of you will have come across our Reimagine London project. As Greg mentioned, this was a response to the New London agenda that we launched in January, which is our best practice for placemaking based on the 6 pillars of placemaking. I think we've got a few slides, actually, have we, Hope? I'll just wait for those to come up. So the Reimagining London project was really our way of reaching out to across our membership and across London to get new thinking and new ideas on what we feel London should be doing and some of the kind of key issues that particularly young people, people from the built environment and policy leads think that we should be tackling. So we received hundreds of submissions from a range of built environment professionals, as I say, community organisations, innovators, entrepreneurs, as well as students. And we announced the winners at the London Real Estate Forum. And our first presentation there was from our Young Londoners Prize. So that's for an idea by or in collaboration with under 25-year-olds. So I'm not sure where these slides are, but we do have some slides coming.
The slides are up, Benjamin. I think you just need to run them.
They are up. Hang on a second. Right, it's my fault. Here we go. Okay, Reimagine London. 100 ideas. We've got 25 shortlisted ideas. So those are all on display at the London Centre right now. So they will be up until the new year. So please do come along to the London Centre to see those. As I mentioned, we had a Young Londoner Prize. We had an overall winner. And then we also had our People's Choice Award. So the process for judging the awards was really interesting. And it's the first time, as I say, we applied the metrics of the New London agenda to pick our winners. So we had expert assessors from across our network looking at each pillar and deciding to what extent each entry fulfilled the requirements of the New London agenda. So what we ended up with was a really rigorous group of 25 quite different ideas. Some of the more blue sky thinking aspirational ideas, but the really interesting thing was some of the key themes that came out. And we're quite pleased to see that community engagement was probably the top thing that came out, as well as accessibility. And I'm going to click through a few of the ideas just to give you an idea of the types of entries that we received. So we had a lot around how we can kind of activate our spaces. So this was an idea based around the Rec in Brixton, but this idea of pop-up spaces that could be used for all sorts of things. So skill sharing, barbecues, games nights, open mic nights, and a number of ideas focused on how do we activate our public spaces to create a better sense of community. East London Waterworks was actually our People's Choice Prize. Really interesting development, but a real look at how you can sustainably develop a space like East London Waterworks. So that we have a lot more detail in the exhibition for you on that one. This was our overall winner, and there's a really interesting story behind it. It was actually someone from our industry who struggles with accessibility, and I think she was tasked with coming into London for a meeting, but basically said, "Look, actually coming into London is incredibly difficult for me." And it was the first time her colleagues were able to hear some of the challenges that she faces just getting around London. And the idea was effectively we have things like Lime bikes across our city to make our city more accessible. But if you have differing needs, where can you get things that might make that easier for you? So sensory aid hires, mobility aid hires, different kinds of wayfinding that are taking into account people with differing neurodiversity. So really, really inspiring a concept and idea. They have a lot more visuals as part of their exhibition. We had ideas about the way we now live on social housing, but also mixed communities. And this kind of harks back to the era of kind of multiculturalism in London, everybody mixing together. So we had a couple of developments in which how do you make that happen moving forward? This was one of those. Oh, let me just get back. This was a nice idea. So we had an entry about how we can utilize our public spaces to bring music back into people's lives and use those to support the building of communities once again. And it was called the Music Gym. We had a number of different apps about how you can connect communities together. So apps were pretty common. And we had some grand sort of master planning and how we can reimagine spaces like the Westway. We also had one from Earl's Court, which was really interesting. So the scale was really interesting too. So you had these very small scale projects, you had digital projects, and then you had kind of master planning, which was interesting. Another master plan project. And then we had several ideas around London at night. So looking at the nighttime economy, women's safety, creating spaces for young people. And this is one of those from Publica, Her, There, Everywhere. We had a number of infrastructure projects or interesting ideas. Was really actually fascinating. We had a couple on Oxford Street ahead of the Oxford Street announcement about how we might be looking to pedestrianise that space. I think it was literally the week after that those announcements were made. So lots of predictions about how we can start to use those. This was a kind of a Tinder for our disused buildings. So the idea is putting in your requirements for what you want, whether it's a commercial space or residential space, what is it that you're looking for? And you kind of swipe through the different available buildings, which was quite an interesting one. Great. And then I will just mention it's not up here, but we had a really nice idea that won our Young Londoners Prize, which was around how we can make bus stops more welcoming. And that was a really fun idea. And three young people from a school in our network who were completely excellent. I think we've got a video of them online for the London Real Estate Forum. So do check that out. As I say, the exhibition is up until the new year. So do please come along and it tells you all about the Reimagine London and how we're going to be evolving some of these ideas going forward next year.
Great, Benjamin. Thank you very much indeed. And how exciting this has been, and what a great outpouring of creativity and ideas has come from it. So thank you very much. Now, let's move on to introducing our three first speakers. And as I said at the start, we're talking about reimagining cities. And the question is, firstly, why do we need to reimagine our cities? And some of you might point to the pace of change in population, economy, climate, public health. Other things might be the scale, the pace at which our cities are growing and changing often requires us to combine different things in the same place. And of course, the risks that come with urban change require us to reimagine how we do things so that we can do them better. And then how are we going to reimagine cities? Well, obviously, there are great imaginative exercises like the one that Benjamin's just described, but there's also strategy and planning, ways of, as it were, forecasting and predicting the future we want to have and thinking about how we get there. There are big issues, of course, about participation in that and how we get citizens and civic groups and others to be part of that. But then there's also about how we demonstrate change, how we enable people to visualize the future through things that we do. And I'm hoping our three speakers will cover some of that in whichever order they want. We're going to start with Phil Graham. And Phil, as many of you know, is the Executive Director for Good Growth at the Greater London Authority. He's a essentially in charge of all of the activities at the Greater London Authority that speak to both London's built environment and how that impacts on its economy, its population, and its wider environmental issues. Phil, it's great to have you with us. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to. This might be a little bit clunky because there's one set of slides that Hope has got, and then I've got another version of the same slide pack that's got all my notes in it in a different file. So it may get a bit tricky, but we'll try and get there. Thank you for the introduction, Greg. I'm Phil Graham. As you say, I'm the Executive Director for Good Growth at the GLA. I'm on this NLA webinar in the NLA's empty offices because I've had to come into the City of London for other meetings. So it's a slightly sort of inverted experience. But I want to talk about, the GLA isn't really about, in a sort of strange way, reimagining London. The GLA's job is to set a framework that allows London to reimagine itself in many ways, and I want to talk a bit today about the frameworks and the mechanisms that we use to do that, and how those are set up. That covers all of the work that I do. It covers the parts of the GLA's role that are about shaping the city, planning, regeneration, environment, economy. But while I'm not going to talk about it so directly, I think it's really important to say it feeds into other work that we and London do that's not so much about the built environment and about the city, but about the people who make up London, about young people, about women and girls, about health and safety and so on. So how all that fits together is a critical bit. If we move on to the next slide, now my job title is a bit of an odd one, but it's also absolutely critical because I think that good growth is at the heart, in many ways, of the entirety of what the GLA is the Greater London Authority and the Mayor are trying to achieve. And I think there are two really important aspects to that. The first is to say we value growth. We want to see London grow. We are not anti-growth or degrowth. We value the opportunities that it creates. We value, the economic opportunity, the jobs it creates. We value the opportunity it creates to invest in sustainability, to invest in inclusion. We value the fact that it provides the revenues we need to deliver our public services. Growth and change are what make, the blood that pumps through a city and what makes it exciting, what makes it work, what makes it function. So we are here to enable London to grow in every sense, to grow economically, to grow demographically, to grow socially. But not all growth is good growth. And we don't value growth at any cost. So good growth is the driving principle of the Mayor's vision for the city, but it's growth that is socially and economically inclusive, that is physically accessible. It was great seeing some of those ideas in Benjamin's presentation. They're about how you make sure growing London is an accessible London. It's environmentally sustainable, and it is contextual to local places and communities. And if we flip on to the next side, you can see to some degree why that's the case. London is not a homogenous city. It's not a tightly defined sort of consistent core. It's a large, diverse city. It's a polycentric city. It's home to 9 million people, 270 languages, 270 nationalities, 300 languages. There's 3 tiers of government with limited powers, actually, at the mayoral level. A huge amount of the sort of the weight and the ability to make changes either at the borough level, and there are 33 boroughs. It's not like New York where there's just 5. It's either at borough level or at national level. And the job of the GLA in many cases is to sort of hold the ring between those. But it's made up of distinct and unique places. So each place, each locality has its own identity, its own local economy, its own social heritage, its own unique needs and opportunities. There is no Haussmann plan for London. There's no single vernacular. London is in many ways the kind of absolutely classic improvised city. And the work that needs to happen to reimagine London encompasses not just classic London, the central business district as you think about it, but the suburbs, the estates, the green fringes. Each of these is different, but each needs to work, and each needs to work now for the people who live there now, and in the long term, and it needs to work for those who live, work, visit, and play there. We need to create places where people can grow up, where they can grow old, and therefore places and community provide an absolutely fundamental lens and way of organising how we work. And that's at the heart of how we think about how we enable that sort of reimagination of London, and how we think about doing so in a way that's not imposed upon London's places and communities, but that grows from them. And the key document within that, the key framework, if we flip onto the next page, is the London Plan. The London Plan is the strategic framework for London, the spatial development strategy. It's published by the Mayor of London. It is, interestingly, the only strategic regional plan left in the UK, though I think and I hope there may be some interest from our new government about reintroducing strategic regional planning, because I think the success of the London Plan demonstrates the value of that. It shapes how the built environment responds to the Mayor's priorities. It shapes the core challenges, the housing crisis, net zero, the need for inclusive economic growth, and it places good growth at the heart of that. I mean, if you go back into the London Plan, policy one, line one is the promotion of good growth. That means promoting economic and social and environmental development. It means ensuring equality of opportunity, reducing health inequality, and it means achieving sustainable development and critically addressing climate change. And that's both seeking to mitigate climate change, but also to adapt to its unavoidable impacts. The London Plan, the first London Plan was put in place shortly after the Mayoralty of London was created in 2000. I think we may be on the 5th currently, but over that time it has had a huge impact. In terms of the kind of classic NLA conversation, it has enabled the delivery of some extraordinary built environment projects. King's Cross, the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, the Elizabeth Line, all of these have been enabled by the frameworks and the structures in the London Plan. It's also what has helped us to avoid what we would see as some pretty significant missteps, like, and those of you who work on London will remember the tulip idea, which I think, certainly personally, I feel the right decision was taken not to take that forward. But in addition, it's not just about the projects. It has driven significant change more strategically in the nature of what gets built in London. It's significantly increased the delivery of affordable housing through the planning applications that come through. It's driven really big improvements in the sustainability of new buildings in London. It's helped us to protect our cultural infrastructure as London is developed. So it's had a really big impact on the overall fabric of London, as well as just on the kind of the flagship schemes. And we have just said that we are about to begin the process of developing the next London Plan. So there is a huge future opportunity there to go back to what we want to enable, what we want to see happen over the coming years, but also a huge challenge. And that challenge covers many areas, but I think the single biggest one is the challenge of delivering 80,000 homes a year to address what is an exceptionally severe housing crisis in London. And that is going to raise serious questions about how we balance some of those priorities if that challenge is to be met. But if we go on to the next slide, I think it's also important to say that the built environment and the shaping and reimagining of London isn't just about the buildings, the classic built environment. How we use our infrastructure is also critical. And high streets and healthy streets are a really important part of that. Our high streets, there are hundreds of them across London. They're an incredibly important spatial arrangement. Our high streets and local town centres, they are in many cases where people spend the most of their time outside their own home. And understanding how they're used, how they're they are spatially configured, how their economies function, what social value they can provide, is really important to trying to drive change here and make this possible. And adaptive high streets in a world where the nature of retail and the nature of consumption is changing very fast is the model that we're trying to promote. And I'll come on to this in a little while. And we are developing a network around our high streets, which is promoting exemplar projects through our 9.7 million High Streets Fund. But alongside that, the Mayor's transport strategy is built around the guiding principle of healthy streets, that our road infrastructure and our transport infrastructure should provide a better environment for everyone to live and work in, better neighbourhoods, a more accessible environment, and that is critically through encouraging more walking, cycling and public transport use, so our streets are not car dominated in the way they have been in the past, but also about thinking about how those streets themselves can be designed and utilised to be a more effective, a more attractive, a more enjoyable, a more inclusive environment, the kind of London that we want to create. And that's important sustainably, it's important socially, it is also important economically, because coming back to that question of growth driving change, London is not going to continue to attract talent. London is not going to continue to attract investment. London is not going to be a leading global city for business if it doesn't feel like a safe, sustainable, enjoyable, diverse place to be. So those are the kind of formal frameworks. Alongside that, if we move on to the next slide,
just to let you know, Phil, that's your 10 minutes.
Right. Oh my God.
Please move along quick.
Yeah. Okay. So alongside the formal frameworks, we have a significant program of guidance and thought leadership called Good Growth by Design. I'm not going to run through all of these documents that we've produced, but you can see the breadth of that program and how we use that for design research, for design review. We have design review panels and mayoral design advocates who provide insight, for improving the quality of design and for driving improvements in sector representation. If you move on to the next slide, underneath that Good Growth by Design program, we have had the Good Growth Fund, now being superseded by something called the Civic Partnerships Fund, that provides place-based investment for exemplar capital projects to test those principles in practice, to accelerate, enable change, to build a network of place shapers who've worked on these and people who understand about co-design and community engagement and growth and social infrastructure. And there's three great projects there, but we won't have time to talk about those in detail. And we engage with the sector, if we move on to the next slide, to try and promote these ideas. All of this is only possible only through a joined up place-based approach. The GLA is a small organisation, it's a small part of the London governance structure, even if it's a powerful one. So partnerships are the only way in which we can make a difference. We promote co-design, we promote effective engagement, we promote inclusivity of policy. And critically, we promote sector representation because London is one of the most diverse cities on earth. We can't shape good growth in London until we reflect London, and the built environment sector doesn't do that at the moment. And just in my final slide, you can see how poor that is. The white bars are the population of London in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, in terms of disability. The dotted lines are the representation within the architecture and built environment sectors, and you can see they are way below where we are. And this is going to be a critical issue in terms of enabling and shaping and imagining a London that works for everyone. So we work through we try to use the levers available to us through procurement and engagement. The architecture and urbanism framework is a key procurement framework we have in place to enable all of the public sector across London to work with diverse micro practices as well as the established organisations in this field. We've published a supporting diversity handbook, which sort of identifies the barriers and actions that can be taken to address them. We provide practice learning and peer learning frameworks, and we have a professional institutes action plan. We're working with RIBA, with the Institute for Civil Engineers, with RICS, and all of those institutes to convene and to join up approaches across the 6 built environment sectors to make sure that there's a coordinated approach to driving a more diverse sector, a more inclusive sector, which reflects the city we're trying to reimagine. And I'm sorry if I went on a little bit long, but there you go. That's the end. Thank you, Greg.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. There's so much in what you said, and I think people appreciate the fact that you've set it out so clearly. You began by saying it's all about good growth. You explained that the GLA is a small strategic organization that has to partner with others. You said it's about creating the context in which reimagining London can happen, led by Londoners. And you talked particularly about this being not just physical reimagining, but social and environmental and economic as well. You told us about the London plan and its role in shaping the way the city evolves. And you highlighted some of the projects it's enabled. And then you went on to talk about how it's not just about big projects, but it's about homes and streets and the way people live and their amenities. And you ended with a key point there about increasing participation from the whole of London in its built environment and how the city emerges into the future. So thank you very much. You covered a huge amount. Just a big reminder to all of our audience, firstly, to say welcome to all of you. Lovely to have 92 of you with us right now. The chat function is open. There's already people asking question. Azar is asking us, would these projects be classed as part of adaptive reuse? We'll get back to that question in a minute. Please post as much as you want. Questions and comments are all welcome, and we'll try to introduce them into the conversation. And Ruth says she can't see the chat. If someone could send her a message, that would be very helpful. Let's now go to our first guest from outside of the United Kingdom, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Barbara Pons-Geiner, who is the Director General for Barcelona Regional. She may well explain what that is, but Barbara, welcome. Great to have you with us. Tell us about reinvention from the perspective of Barcelona.
Thank you so much, Greg, and it's a pleasure really to be here in this webinar with these such interesting presenters today, and this topic which is really relevant these days, reinventing cities. I am not sure if I can handle the slides. I don't see the arrows to pass my presentation. Now, let's see. Now, okay. So I'm going to share with you this presentation about reimagining Barcelona, and I will definitely explain what Barcelona Regional is and what's my position now from the general direction of this planning agency that belongs to the City Council of Barcelona and the metropolitan area of Barcelona. So just for the audience, you may not know a few numbers about that define Barcelona and how the main challenges and the main concerns we have today about reinventing Barcelona, they all have to do about this good growth that the previous presenter was talking about, the good growth of Barcelona. Barcelona is really breaking the boundaries, the limits of the city, and we still don't have this, the mayor of London, what London did in the year 2000, how it constituted the larger metropolitan region around London. Barcelona is still building that structure around it. So just a few numbers, the Barcelona is a very tiny city, actually, only 1.7 million inhabitants in 100 square kilometers, roughly, divided in 10 districts and 73 neighborhoods. And then this would be this purple area. Here you can see all the different walls of the city, from the Roman origins to the Cerdà plans, the different medieval walls, and then to the 100 square kilometers. And then you have in this other lighter shade, you have the metropolitan area of Barcelona, which is 36 municipalities, now almost 3.3 million inhabitants, 333 square kilometers. And this is what Barcelona has a long tradition of reinventing itself as a city. And it has done since the 19th century. It has reinvented herself with big events, since the great exhibitions of 1888 that kind of transformed the city around the historical walls of the city, until the international exhibition of 1929 also that developed the Montjuic, a big mountain that's a huge park at the city. But then what we know most, or when Barcelona became a global city, was after the Olympic Games in 1992. And since here you have just an image of the different, as far as physical transformation of the city, how in the different periods since the 80s, in 1986 was when the Olympic Games were appointed to Barcelona, was a big accelerator of change of different things that were happening at the city. So it went from small scale squares and street parks, more acupuncture intervention, to from 1986 to 1992, the larger scale, the seafront opening Barcelona. You will see, I will talk a bit more about the seafront, how it's been over and over reinventing itself. By the way, Barcelona never had beaches before. They are all artificial. It was an industrial, rocky area until the 1990s, actually. So you see in green all the big transformations of the Olympic sites of the city and big infrastructure that was built around the city. And then we had another push of transformation more related to the metropolitan scale. And that's when exactly in 1993, after the Olympics, when Barcelona Regional was created, and all this idea of Barcelona becoming big and becoming a region, a consolidated region, began to be part of the reimagination of the city. So right now we're talking about this large Barcelona. We talk the Barcelona region, which is the 5 million Barcelona, which includes more than 160 municipalities in a larger area, but with a very diverse territory. And from Barcelona Regional, we're working, trying to draw this plan, which is in process right now, which is the 2025, 2035, 2050 vision for the region that will be presented next year. So we're going to have like a 10-year and a 25-year perspective over what needs to happen strategically in the larger region of Barcelona. So let me tell you briefly, I like to show this map because this is the first hybrid map that was designed in Barcelona Regional back in 1994, actually 30 years now that it's been working, this planning agency that was created with all the talent around the Olympic transformation of the city, all the engineers and architects at the time. It was a small company that has grown now to 100 people. It began only with architects and engineers, as I say, but now it's a much more diverse company where we have environmentalists, we have people that work at the psychology field, in the economy, and in up to 17 disciplines that have to do with the transformation and the rethinking of the urban environment. So from this very original map right after the Olympics, that was a combination back in 1994 of digital and hand-drawn techniques. We have been evolving over 30 years with the different institutions, and we have been helping reimagining the city. We help rethink from big transformations that have to do, many of them with pacifying or transforming big avenues that were only for cars to making them more pedestrian friendly and more more environmentally sound, more healthy, to all scales, at the larger scale, to the neighborhood scale, and also regaining public spaces at the block scale. So we work all the scales through the city in order to help rethink neighborhoods, districts, and municipalities, metropolitan municipalities. So how are we working on this vision to trying to reimagine the region of Barcelona? We are aware that we have like a lack of comprehensive strategic planning, but we have many plans going on in different sectors, sectorial plans, different from the European Union, from the Spanish central government. So we tried also international agendas like the 2030 agenda. So we try to make an overview of what's happening, or too many people thinking about the same territory. What does it mean? And we try to organize. And it has to do a little bit with the methodology that we have seen before from the New London Agenda. I was happy to see. I didn't know the initiative, but it kind of resonates with some of the things of the thinking we're doing about how we should rethink and reimagine our territories. So, of course, we are a planning agency, public planning agency. We know a lot about mapping, GIS, analysis, diagnosis, indicators, data. We work with that. We're based, we want to make good decisions based on data. But the important thing is how you add intelligence to this, how you transform that into something that's meaningful to make special transformations, physical transformation, and also public policy by defining objectives, also working with different agents and try to come to just a few list of objectives that are priorities for everyone, and then going to implementation. We see many planning that dies in this implementation gap. So we try to help a lot in this, how to jump from these marvelous plannings that we sometimes we get through, but then how it gets really implemented. So here we found in the literature, there's this idea about the 3 T's: translation, trust, and time. We try to work with this, how to build trust between agents, we work with different timeframes, with different institutions and different planning, already sectorial planning of different sectors that have to do with the physical transformation of the city. And how do we translate, how we do work in the process in talking to different people with different priorities, the neighbors, companies, entrepreneurs, academia, and how do we work these difficulties in order to get this planning that addresses the medium term, which will be 10-year horizon, and the long term, which will be 25 years. And we work with the 3 scales of the city: the local scale with the local agents at the neighborhood scale, the metropolis scale, and then beyond the metropolis, how we work with this global impact or this global image of Barcelona. So we have come right now just to let you know a brief how, because it's an in-process document or plan. So these are some of the topics that we find we need to address in this plan, and we are working in many of these topics to refine the objective list that we were saying. Things like, we know, like climate change, but it's translated into energy transition, sustainable mobility, which is related to the previous one, decarbonization in general, things that were mentioned before, access to housing, an aging society also, which is something, many of these topics are very common to almost all cities, or most cities, especially in Europe, in our environment. And then we work with different documents. We just don't do this final PDF or paper document. Just we work with more interactive tools that can make a dynamic planning process. So the evolution of this plan can be monitored, can be transparent, and can be shared with all the Barcelonian society. And just I wanted to share this transformation of the coast and how Barcelona has been reinventing its contact with the Mediterranean Sea. Since here you have an image of the first flight of Barcelona, of Spain, actually, that was done by the US military in Spain at the time in the 1950s. So the 1956 flight is how the coastline of Barcelona was at the time. As I said, there were in this part, I don't know if you don't see my cursor, I guess, but you see how the line has nothing to do with the current port and the Olympic port, the commercial port that has grown and transformed the coastline, and the shores have gained a lot of land to the sea. So, and this is an image, a photo image of what was the coastline of Barcelona back in the 1980s. So really the transformation has been huge. The reinvention has been enormous since. These are a few images of what the coast is today. It's been strongly transformed, but still there are many places where we are still rethinking what to do and how to adapt, because we know, and we have recent events in Spain, a bit south of Barcelona, in Valencia, about flooding events, and these episodes. We know the Mediterranean, we are at the core of the climate change. It's warming 20% faster than the rest of the world. So we have these extreme events with more frequency and with more intensity. So we are rethinking all constantly what we have in order to be prepared and be more resilient. So just I wanted to share this project that we're doing from our agency, which is the northern part of the promenade, the sea promenade of Barcelona, that it is still, it needs to go under transformation. How we are thinking about the project, just very briefly, a few images. This is how we are, instead of bringing the buildings all the way to the front line of the beach, that probably we would have done back in the 80s, we are now building this park, these protections. So we are prepared to the rise of the sea, that could raise. We know it's going to raise. We don't know how much or how fast, but we know we will be prepared. So this is how we're introducing this climate change and the needs of the people to have recreation areas, but also to be resilient to this transformation. And just very briefly to finish this first wrap of how Barcelona reimagines herself is how do we do that? We are a planning agency. We help both the city council and the metropolitan area to rethink themselves, and we help them do these the events. We work a different scale. We don't think about global big events, but we think about exchange events with both the cities, the neighbors, the communities in the city, and also we open to experts, to people from other cities that come and share experiences with Barcelona about how to reinvent the city. This is the React event that we did 3 editions right after the pandemics. We did the first one in 2021, and it was this effort, this energy to see how cities could rebound after or react to the post-COVID period. We had 3 of these events that were very helpful in order to rethink, to get ideas, to get energy, and how to reimagine the city. And now with this process of the 2035, 2050 plan, we are rethinking how to make this event. We will do one in the spring of 2025 to help bring more energy, new ideas, and to share these, to test these projects and ideas with a larger audience. So up here, my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, Barbara, thank you very much indeed. There's so much in what you've said, but you began by saying that really Barcelona has a history of reinventing itself, and you took us through some of the contours of that. But you also said that it's a city that has to work at multiple scales, from the neighborhood to the local to the city to the metropolitan. You explained some of the way the topography shapes that. And then you talked about this very interesting combination of imaginative strategic planning coupled with local implementation and the enabling of that. Trust, translation, and time featured as key focuses for you. And you talked about the 2050 vision that you're now building and the 2035 to 2050 plan that you're working on. And then you gave us some fantastic examples of how the coastline of Barcelona has changed and how in the new cycle you're adapting the coastal change, the waterfront change to climate and to sea level rises. And you ended with the Barcelona React, the reactivation of the city after the pandemic and how you develop that participative platform. So thank you so much, Barbara. Really interesting stuff. And let me just say again to our 97 delegates, firstly, welcome again. Secondly, thank you, Ruth, for pursuing the question, how do you participate? You can either use the chat if you like, or you can use the Q&A function. I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet. Please send us your comments and your questions, and we'll deal with those when we get to the discussion. But let's immediately welcome Øyvind Satvit, who's an Assistant Director General at the City of Oslo. And prior to his current role, Øyvind was also the Director General of the Oslo Regional Alliance. So he knows a lot about all of these issues. Øyvind, welcome to the Cities Roundtable. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greg. Very happy to be here. I'm going to talk about a journey in Oslo that really started out in the 1980s, 1990s, and is still going on. And it's been a quite dramatic change in many ways. I think you once mentioned, Greg, that Oslo is really like a new world city in the old world. We are in some ways perhaps a little bit un-European. We don't have we have not been a very rich capital in previous times, but we have really come into wealth and become a wealthy city quite recently. And we've also taken our step onto the global stage quite recently, which is something that we perhaps share with Barcelona, among other cities, but we have come even later than Barcelona onto that stage. So I'll just take you through some major points in that journey. First of all, just let me share some facts about Oslo. And I must admit, I laughed a little bit when I heard Barbara talking about Barcelona being a tiny city, because Oslo is much tinier. We are just 720,000 inhabitants in Oslo. Although we have a larger urban area, about 1.1 million people, and in the greater metropolitan region, 64 municipalities, we are 2.3 million people. But that being said, we've actually had a very sharp growth, and we have actually been among the cities that has grown most in Europe for the past 10 or 15 years. And that's really been fueled by those changes that I'll talk more about in a bit. It's also important to note that we are a knowledge city. That it wasn't always the case, but I think now the knowledge-based industries are really dominant in the city, and we also have a very high value creation in the city based on knowledge-intensive industries. So that's also a very important part to mention here at the start. But as I said, we've had a big transformation of Oslo. This picture is from the 1980s, where we actually had a shipyard right outside the city hall. You see the building with the two towers. That's the city hall of Oslo. And right outside there, you had a big shipyard building ships and also oil platforms. Of course, Norway came into oil in 1969, which really transformed the whole economy of Norway. But as a result of that, the whole economy also in Oslo needed to change. So this was really at the end of the industrial period of Oslo. From the 18th and 19th centuries, we had a lot of industries established in Oslo. But when we moved into the 2000s, the cost of having industry was really too high. So we really needed to create a new basis for the Oslo economy, and the knowledge-based sector then became the most important sector. So we really needed to change. We needed to change from an industrial city to a knowledge-based city, and we also needed to use the space in the city in a new way in order to make that possible. So what we did was really a major transformation of the waterfront. This is actually the same area now, how it looks now, where the shipyard was previously. And we've actually all around the waterfront transformed the city from industrial purposes, harbor purposes, creating a more people-friendly city where the public now has access to the waterfront. We have opened up the waterfront for establishing new businesses, offices for knowledge-based industries, but also cultural institutions, restaurants, and such. And this has really transformed Oslo in a very physical way, and is still going on, as I said. We also saw that in order to keep on changing, as I said, we needed to find our place on the global stage. And we became aware around 2005, 2010, that period, that we weren't really very well known in the world. We were unknown, and actually there was a business school that said that Oslo was actually known for being unknown. So we needed to fill that gap, and we started working out on the brand management strategy to help us be better at communicating what we are and who we are to the rest of the world. And that is a value-based strategy. We through several workshops and also including people from abroad, we tried to define what is really special about Oslo. And we saw that there are some underlying values that really define us. We are pioneering in that we are early adapters for new technology. We are explorers, explorers to both the North Pole and the South Pole, originated in Oslo, for instance. But also through the work that we've done in the oil sector, the knowledge behind that was, of course, based on pioneering research in that field. We see now that we are pioneering within the cancer research, but also in adapting to new climate solutions and environmentally friendly policies, for instance. We have the welfare system in Norway, which we are, along with the rest of the Scandinavian countries, we are proud of. And we feel that this gives a possibility for people to live their lives to fulfill their ambitions. And also we have a culture in Norway which is really informal in many ways. We are direct, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing, but it also makes us down to earth and real. What you see is what you get. And these three values really has been underlying in how we want to communicate about Oslo. What we also see that, and this is almost through serendipity perhaps, but as a matter of fact, these values have also been entrenched in how we have physically developed the city, trying to encompass also these values in the physical transformation, although that was really not the ambition of the brand strategy, but we see that there are some shared common values, both in how we think about the city and how the city has actually physically been transformed. We work a lot on the people-friendly city, as I said, but also innovation as an important driver in the development of the city. We have established innovation districts like Barcelona has, which are very important now in creating the right conditions for innovation and as a basis for the change in the economy. But also, as I said, making this a people-friendly city. The new opera house is not only for upper class people, but is actually something that is open up to the public as a whole and used for big public events, like you see in the picture here on the top. And also the cultural scene within food culture, which includes the whole register of different types of foods, is also a very important transformation of Oslo, and also the global feel to the city with the introduction of food traditions from the whole world, which has come together with also Oslo being a much more international city with 25-30% of the population coming from other countries. And also a very important driver for change in Oslo, as I already mentioned, is the climate agenda. And although Oslo and Norway is strongly connected to the oil and gas economy, or perhaps just because of that, we see that we need to be a front runner in climate change. And we have actually adopted very ambitious policies in this area. We were the European Green Capital in 2019. We have adopted a climate budget that actually measures all the CO2 emissions from both the public and the private sector in the city. And we try to mitigate those emissions through direct policies in different areas. The city, of course, works a lot with making the private cars less dominant in the city. We also have a very high percentage of electric vehicles. I think almost 100% of all new cars being sold in Oslo now are electric cars. I think there's only 2 or 3% that are not electric. But we also see that all the public transport is zero emission. We work with zero emission building sites. We also work with carbon capture and storage, which is also a very important part of our policies in that area. And this is also very important in how to build a new, more innovative and people-friendly city. So that was just very briefly some of the changes that have been taking place in Oslo. We are different in many ways from the other cities that you heard. I haven't talked about all the spatial planning. Of course, we've had several plans underlying this change, but I can come back to that in the round afterwards if there are any questions.
Oyvind, thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating. And I think for people who don't know Oslo, given that it's famous for not being very well known, or it's known for being not known, you've really started to reveal the city to people. I love what you say about Oslo being a newcomer in the sort of European and global urban networks. You talked about it being a knowledge city, a city of many transformations going on, with this real focus on urban life and giving people a quality of life in the city they haven't enjoyed before. And you underpin that with your conversation about identity and about the values behind the identity, pioneering, enriching, and real. and you said that that was informing everything. And then, of course, you ended with this big comment about how Oslo has become a real leader on the climate agenda. Very important for Norway that Oslo does that, not only so that you can tackle the challenge of the legacy industries that you have, but also so that Oslo can be a city that's ready to host an alternative economy for Norway. And I know you've been working at that. So thank you very much. The real reinvention of Europe's fastest growing capital. Let's just remind our guests and everyone who's participating, the 94 of you who are still with us, you can join the chat, you can join the Q&A. Phil, there's already a question for you. I'm not going to ask you to answer it now because I want to bring in Stephen, but it's about post-pandemic changes in London and whether or not the prevalence of tall buildings is still logical after the pandemic. That's in the Q&A function if you want to see that. But let's immediately bring in Stephen and say thank you to Stephen for joining us. It's great to have Stephen Barrett here as a director of RSHP. Stephen, your reaction to what you've heard so far from London, from Barcelona, and from Oslo, but also your comments about the experience in Paris, where I know your practice is very active. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's this morning's kind of insights into these fantastic three cities in Europe reminds me and underlines for me what a great continent we are, partly because of this diversity. I mean, we could have a talk just about the difference between Paris and London. You could talk about the compare and contrast for all of these cities. And necessarily, because of the time we've got here, it's a kind of quick caricature, I guess, but caricatures can be useful. Paris is far more monocentric than London. I mean, one of the things post-COVID that was very evident is the degree to which London is composed of local centres. And local centres are important because they're about distance and they're also about kind of economy of movement, but economy of carbon as well, and community. And that was something that came out of the London description. Paris is a planned city. I mean, someone said, you know, it's London is not Haussmann. And I think it's very true that architecture and urbanism in Paris are a form of politics by other means. They're politics made manifest. And when the politics and the policy are aligned, they can be incredibly powerful and dynamic. And I think anyone who knows Paris will have seen how Paris has transformed itself in the last decade or so. When we were part of the Grand Paris Metropolitan Study, which was subtitled the Post-Kyoto Metropolis, and obviously we've gone a long way since then. The fact is that I think the teams from Germany, from Holland, and including ourselves coming from the UK, we're talking very much more about carbon, about climate than the French teams. I think that situation has transformed massively. I think France now is very innovative and very much setting an agenda on climate, whether it be at city or regional or state level. And as I say, this comes back to politics. One of the things that's noticeable, and I'll say this in the form of a joke, imagine two diplomats in Brussels, at least at a time when the UK was involved in European politics, or more involved in European politics. They come out of a meeting, they've just been talking about a piece of legislation, and the French man will turn to the Brit and say, well, I understand how that works in practice, but how does it work in theory? And the Brit will say, well, I understand how that works in theory, but how the hell does it work in practice? And I think one of the things that we notice working both sides of the channel is that the public-led vision, the vision of the common good, the common interest in Paris, very much led by the public sector, sets a vision, a strategic plan. And that has a great power. The slightly more bottom-up, and I would say generally private-led initiatives of London make London a kind of effervescent, innovative city, as to use the term that Phil Graham used. And that has a kind of great dynamism. And I think just to conclude, because I mustn't go on, I'm just commenting here. I think in the UK, particularly at the moment, we're conscious of entering an age of let's say austerity, difficult times, where a lot of difficult choices need to be made. And I think getting this balance between good growth, so a kind of regulated growth, something that has the long term and the common interest in mind, while also encouraging initiative growth, economic growth, development that is mindful of climate, mindful of community. That is probably the biggest challenge.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Very thoughtful reflections. And in particular, your last point, which I would like to put back to the panelists in a few minutes, about how in the context of climate change do you really activate the kind of the civic nature of citizenship in the cities. But I very much enjoyed your remarks about the differences between London and Paris, and your joke is a great one, right? And in Paris, it's okay, it's all very good in practice, but how does it work in theory? In London, it's all very good in theory, but how does it work in practice? I think that's a brilliant summary. It's a bit like the French live to eat, but the English eat to live, isn't it? It's a similar kind of idea. Thank you very much for that. Let's go immediately to a few questions that people have already raised. And Phil, there's one question for you that's all about sort of post-pandemic London and whether that changes the way we think about, the future of the city and its built environment. Or even there's one for you that's about the right to roam in Oslo and why that's important and how you've been able to do that. And Barbara, there's one for you from Magali. How has, she's really asking, how has this kind of exemplar of urban reforms that Barcelona has had, how has it been impacted by the recent changes in mayor and by the fact that actually you've had different mayors of different political parties over the last period? Is there still a consensus even when you're shifting the mayor who's in power? But Phil, why don't you start with a bit of a response on the post-COVID London question?
Very happy to. London is inevitably becoming a more polycentric city at the moment. I think there is no doubt about that. I think that's not to downplay the continuing importance of the central London sort of economic core. That is always going to be a uniquely strong kind of agglomeration of economic activity, but both the pattern of development across London is shifting, the pattern of economic activity is shifting, the CAS, as we always call it, is growing, and the way in which people work there is changing. But I think that polycentrism has perhaps been increasing polycentrism has been perhaps been accelerated a bit by COVID. I don't think COVID has been the driving force behind it. I think it's the changing nature of the London economy. I think it's the shift towards kind of London becoming more of a place for kind of frontier innovation and less as a place for sort of simple delivery of kind of services, whether they're financial and professional services or other forms, and that changes the nature of the sort of the commercial environment that London leads. It changes the nature of the way in which people work together. So I think that does lead to some changes in terms of how we're thinking about kind of opportunity areas and the shape of the London economy. It's not to say at all we're abandoning the CAS, but we think that we need to think about how we maintain the attractiveness of the CAS, and you see that. I think the mayor's intervention with regard to Oxford Street is a really important example of how we want to keep doing that. But it's also the makeup of what types of activity happen there. We're seeing, the cultural and creative sectors are taking up a greater part of the central London. Life sciences are encroaching in. The universities are perhaps bigger players in there. But it also means we're thinking about how we can create really back the kind of innovation and commercial clusters in other parts of the city which are growing fast. I mean, the change that you see in Stratford around the Queen Elizabeth Park is a great example of that. White City, the Sutton Cancer Hub, some of the film quarters that are growing up. We need to make sure that we're supporting that, because that's reflecting changes in the way the economy works. I mean, in terms of tall buildings, I think the short answer is, to some degree, let's wait and see. I mean, what we have definitely seen in the city is a flight to quality. There is still a desire for the kind of the flagship HQ to be in the centre of the City of London, for space, for connection, for innovation, for creation in the centre of London. A lot of that is being generated at the moment by rethinking the way in which those tall office buildings are used. We're seeing landlords trying to aggregate to provide greater space for single businesses. As that plays out in terms of new buildings, I think we will wait and see whether what the market really needs is continued towers, or whether that kind of HQ space is perhaps better provided in different ways. And the Google building in King's Cross looks very, very different to your classic tower. But what isn't going to change, it certainly isn't going to change as fast as we would like, is the continuing housing crisis and the need to continue to increase densities in terms of residential development. That doesn't have to be delivered through tall buildings, but tall buildings are definitely one bit of the toolkit to try and achieve that. And that pressure to make sure that we're responding to the need to increase housing numbers in London and to increase critically affordable housing in London is not going anywhere anytime soon, COVID or no COVID.
Phil, it's a very good answer, if I may say, and it's the sort of thing that we hear as well in Hong Kong and Singapore and New York and many other cities at the moment. I think you've really said three things. The nature of the urban economy is changing, and therefore the spatial character of the economy is changing with it. In London's case, becoming more polycentric, but not at the expense of the centre. The second thing you've said is that actually the number of jobs within the city, despite hybrid working, is actually growing. So it's possible that you can grow in the CAS and also grow in many districts around London. And then you've also made, I think, the really crucial point that the built environment is also a resource that can be upcycled. And as the flight to quality occurs, more buildings that are not in demand can be reused in other ways. And housing is obviously one of the priorities. You made that really clear. Somebody's just asked us to explain what the CAS is. Can you answer that just in one question?
I've just answered it in the chat, actually.
Good,
But sorry,
Central
it's
Activity
a bit of
Zone.
Jackson. It's the Central Activity Zone. It's a specific demarcation in the London plan for kind of the City of London, the core West End, and Canary Wharf, the Northern Isle of Dogs. But I think we're better off thinking about the central London economy than the CAS, because the CAS is changing all the time, even if the designation hasn't changed yet.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Phil. Very good answer. Oyvind, let's come to you. So one of our guests has raised here this issue of the right to roam. This is a question from Canon Ivers from LDA Design. He says, how can other global cities learn from Oslo's philosophy of Allemannsrechten, I think it is, the right to roam, and avoid overprotective measures in the public realm, such as barriers, balustrades, and bollards, which is very good use of alliteration. But Oyvind, what can we learn from Oslo's experience there?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. And this is not only a principle that applies for Oslo, it's actually for all of Norway. And I think Norwegians mostly think of this in terms of something which is important in the rural areas, in nature. There are no private woods in Norway, although they are privately owned. Some of them, you can freely go everywhere in nature. But this also applies to beachfronts, the waterfront. So even though you have a private garden going down to the sea, nobody can be denied the access to that area. And that way of thinking is really about the non-hierarchical way of thinking in Norway. We have a very flat society where there's not supposed to be a big difference between those who have a lot and those who do not. And of course, this has also been important in city planning within Oslo, because when we want to open up the city, make the waterfront accessible, it's also about the same thing, really, that all these areas should be accessible to everyone and should not be privatized. That's not in practice. That's not always as easy as it sounds, of course, but because people all the time want to privatize their areas. But I think this principle has been very important in the transformation of the city, that we wanted to open up the city and make it more accessible in line with that thinking. And I think actually that is something that other cities could learn from.
Great. Well, very glad to hear about it. And no doubt we'll invite you to tell us much more on another day, Oyvind, because it sounds fascinating. Let's go to Barbara. And Barbara, the question that Magali was asking you is, you've got this great kind of urban pioneer mentality, but you've had changes of mayors. And if I'm not wrong, I think you've had mayors from 3 different political parties in the last 20 years. So how do you cope with that level of political change? And does it mean continuity or discontinuity?
Actually, I think it was Stephen who said that urban planning and planning in general is very politic. I mean, politics and urban planning are very tied together, and it reflects a way of thinking about many other things that are embraced into politics. And definitely this has been the case for Barcelona, even if I guess, and many cities in the world have a deep trend of taking cars out of the city centers, which is I think is the way to go for many different reasons. And I think it's citizens and societies who demand that. But in Barcelona, in the last years, we've had in the last 12 years, 3 different political parties, but we have 6 political parties in the city council. So really we have come to a very complex and divided political system at the local level. And this has, I mean, good and bad things. One of the things is that many things have to be agreed, and the pact is always necessary. So is what they say. Somebody told me, what's a camel? A camel, it's a horse that has been negotiated in Brussels. So this is more or less what we get. You don't get the horse you wanted. You get a camel with something here, something there, but you get something that walks and moves. And so I think the story of city transformation in the last 8, 12 years has gone a little bit of zigzag, but in the end, the main trend is the same. And actually, when the main but also I think because cities are the places for conflict, I think there's many conundrums around this transformation because Barcelona, I don't know how many of you are city planners, but you may be familiar with the concept of a super block that Barcelona has put forward, how to transform cities or blocks of cities in order to gain space, to take space out of cars and gain space for pedestrians and other uses or green uses of the city. This has been internationally a very successful policy. Myself have been explaining this policy for many international delegations and come visit Barcelona. But inside Barcelona, the process of transformation of the last green access and super blocks has been highly contested in the press, by the media, by different sectors of the economy, by different neighbor organizations. So it has not been an easy process. It was accelerated in the past 4 years because of EU funds. So the previous mayors could do strong transformation of more than I think 4 kilometers of green access in the city, in very central parts of the city, that have been very successful for many citizens, but that also have had other side effects, such as green gentrification, or it has made bus speed in the city slower. So mass public transportation has become worse in the city center. So you don't really take cars out of the city unless you have, so we know we have the same amount of cars or even a bit more, but just in parallel streets, not in that very street. So the current mayor now, like the baseline, and he is kind of making most of the policies are continuing, but at a slower pace, also because the EU funds are coming slower these days, and also because there are some side effects that need to be rethink. Now the priority has been set in this, since the last year election has been set in we know we have a priority, which is cleaning the air in Barcelona, taking cars out of the city, but we need to do that by fostering and empowering or improving the speed of bus, improving mass public transportation, and not so much by pedestrianizing cities. That also we need to do that, but the energy now needs to be put back to public transportation. So I think it's a little bit where you put the accent, but the current mayor is not going to undo the changes that the previous mayor has done, of course. But definitely the priority is kind of shifting a little bit.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And I mean, this explanation I think is really helpful, and this is how you achieve some continuity. One thing you didn't say that I might just ask you to comment on, of course, is that the current mayor was a deputy mayor in the former administration, and your administrations tend to rule by coalitions, right, relating to the proportion of votes achieved. So even though one person is the mayor, most of the parties are represented in some way in the coalition. Is that fair?
Yes, that's totally so. So the current mayor was the first deputy mayor the previous 4 years. And these agreements on these green super block strategies, of course, were done by agreement at the city council. You need a majority in order to push these urban transformations forward, to approve the projects, etc. So yes, there's these different equilibriums, and then so now he's saying we have another big discussion about the tramway in the diagonal avenue in the city, and the project was to continue the tramway all through the diagonal, and that is going to be so, but not as fast as it was going to do previously. Now the calendar has been readjusted because of budgetary reasons. So, but it's going to be done, and then, well, I don't know. It's all about negotiations and priorities, but yeah, definitely it's negotiation time.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So what we're going to do now, we've got about 12 minutes remaining. In a minute, I'm just going to ask Stephen to reflect a little bit on what's the longer term legacy of the Reinventing Paris project as you see it, Stephen. We'd like to have a few comments about that. Phil, there's then a quick question to you about pension funds and the use of sovereign wealth in investing in cities, picking up the Oslo example. But then I'd really like to ask us all the question, what else do we need to reimagine in our cities? What is it that needs to be reimagined in the next cycle as we begin it now? What are the things that perhaps we can rethink so that our cities can behave and operate in ways that they haven't done before? Let's build a bit of an agenda around that. And then we'll say thank you and we'll close. So, Stephen, over to you first. What do you think will prove to be the legacy of the Reinventing Paris programme?
I think the answer is a little bit like Phil's answer about tall buildings in London. We have to see. I think it's still in process. We actually happened to win one of those initiatives, a site outside the centre of Paris. And just to remind everyone, centre of Paris is 2 million. That's what we think, 2 million people. That's what we think of as Paris. There are 9 million who live outside the périphérique of central Paris. And I think one of the biggest challenges for Paris is that integration of the whole metropolis, because there are definitely zones that suffer from far greater inequality and underinvestment, given the populations represented. But to be concrete, goes back to what we were saying earlier, and I don't know where it comes from. I was told it's in relation to Milton Keynes, which is not a very glamorous example, but the master plans, and I'm speaking as a master plan, as a designer of master plans, need to be designed to survive 3 changes of government. I.e., there needs to be enough fundamental that everyone can agree on, that whatever form it ends up taking, it builds consensus and it can survive change. Our own experience in Paris is that there are times when it can be terrifically dynamic because you have that alignment. But we've also worked for years on master plans that have been shelved because of changes in political alignment. We won a competition for the site around Montparnasse Station in Paris. One of Paris is, in fact, Europe's biggest stations, with a tall building that sits a little bit isolated, like a stalk of asparagus in a field of wheat, to quote Philip Johnson. And we won that competition with a plan to reduce car access, but also to pedestrianize, but also significantly plant 1,000 trees around this station, which is quite a radical vision. One of the things that, I mean, whatever action you're defining for any of these cities is going to reflect the strengths and weaknesses of those cities. And I think one of the things in Paris was it being central Paris being a very mineral city. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on greening Paris. I think, the formal ambitions of the Reinvent Paris project was really to try and find the levers to transform difficult sites. And I think it's always the difficult sites that are the best test in a way. And I think for us, certainly that comes with public space first, building second, but obviously there's synergy between the two. And the current Paris local plan for climate includes things like housing, which was something that Phil just mentioned, with an objective of 40% of housing in Paris being public or social housing by 2035. And that underlines the kind of challenge, but it also underlines as a target the degree to which the state in its various forms considers itself to have a very important role in that process in Paris and in France generally.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I mean, and anything that helps us to unblock difficult sites is obviously useful. And to have this imaginative layer with it, I think is really interesting. By the way, we'd love to see your proposition. So if you can pop a link in the chat, that would be really helpful. Two very quick questions before we get on to the final round. Barbara, there's one question in the chat that says, we understand it takes 2 to 3 years for people to adjust to the remodeled neighborhoods around the super blocks. Is that right? And if so, is that the length of time you need to give this kind of change?
Yes, I would say at least 2-3 years. But we also have had different experiences now since 2012 in different neighborhoods of the city. We did the very first super block was done by tactic means, painting the floor and doing, and it was in a very not so dense neighborhood of the city in Poblenou, and we had some experience there. The first shock was kind of strong, and then people adapted and began to see the good part of it, but still there was conflict, a little bit of conflict around it. Then we did that experience after COVID also with tactic means in the most dense parts of the city. And it was quite successful at the time. And then with these EU funds, it could be done permanent. And that was when many other, people that had commerce were having doubts whether that was good or bad for their businesses. And now what we are doing from our planning agency is to actually monitor what's happening in those green axes. And the most interesting and difficult monitoring is about gentrification. How do you have one street that has become green, only pedestrians and very beautiful looking, and then the parallel, you have more vehicles than you used to have before. You have worse quality of air. So we're monitoring both housing prices in both axes and how you can, because that's really an undesired effect, but it's definitely something that happens, and we need to really. So there's the adapting of the people living there, but also that could not access their garages as easily as before to get to the parking. But also they have other benefits. But also from the city perspective, what impact is having in a larger array of different things.
Great. So all those substitution and displacement effects, very, very interesting. Philip, are we going to take a leaf out of Oslo's book and start to use pension funds and other institutional investors more? Just a short answer, if you don't mind.
We would love to. There are challenges around UK pension funds investing in infrastructure, though there has been the Mansion House speech. There's a lot of stuff in the papers today about the government trying to make changes around that. And a lot of foreign pension funds have invested an awful lot in UK infrastructure, and that hasn't been without controversy. I would say we would love to find new routes for financing the infrastructure we need. But I think it is really important to say pension funds are not a panacea. These are big commercial organisations that have to make a return on their pension, on their investments, in order to pay the pensions of whether it is foreign or British workers who are coming back round. So, it still only works if you can find the mechanisms. You need the funding as well as the financing and the mechanisms to enable that to be repaid. So it's definitely something that we want to explore. It's definitely an alternative option for investment, but it's not free money.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. So we're on to the last round, 1 minute each, no more. We'll start with Oivind, then we'll go Stephen, Philip, and then Barbara. What else do we need to reimagine or reinvent in our cities as we enter this next phase of our lives? So Oivind, over to you.
Well, in addition to what I already mentioned, I think the really big challenge for us is social inclusion and integration. We look with fear to what is happening in a lot of the Swedish cities, where they have a very sharp rise in crime and also youth crime. We are not there yet in Oslo, but we're following that very closely. And I think we'll need to invest a lot more in the suburbs. We need to work a lot with affordable housing. We need to create jobs in these areas. So that's really the major challenge for us, I think, in the coming years, in addition to what I've already said.
Great, Oyvind. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen, what else do we need to reimagine or reinvent?
In the UK, I think there's a big debate about planning, and I think that is an important debate because it's all negotiated in the UK, which makes it quite democratic, which is good. But I think when you can see the relative dynamism of some of the processes in France, which is slightly more linear, slightly more Cartesian, I think that would help. But the climate is in the end the biggest thing that we need to address.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Thank you for everything you've just put in the chat. Really, really useful stuff. Philip, what else do we need to reinvent or reimagine from your point of view? You're on mute, Phil. Sorry.
To be honest, I'm not going to add a lot to what Oyvind and Stephen has said. As the London economy, there are big shifts going on in the shape of the London economy. There are big shifts going on in terms of how we can, in terms of the talent available to us, London, sort of how we sit within Europe, and making that shifting, changing successful economies through housing, through transport, through skills. That's the shift we really need to see alongside enabling London's transition to net zero.
Yeah, we're hearing you in patches, Phil, but do you want to just see if you can conclude there?
Sorry, I had concluded. Sorry, blame the NLA's Wi-Fi.
Right.
But inclusion and net zero.
Inclusion and net
Get
zero.
away from that.
Great. Barbara, what else do we need to reinvent or reimagine in our cities?
I think listening to all the interesting stories here and looking back to the challenges we have in Barcelona, I think to me the challenge is really to allocate the planning methodology, the way in between, because we are also in between this Paris Cartesian top-down way of planning, but also this very agreed, packed, and democratic. We have a strong civil society and many not strong parties, so also has to be negotiated. So in the end, you get a policy that is not really. But because the challenges are so strong, we need to find the right scale and the right choices. And maybe it's working with this Matsukato approach of missions. And I think it's very good, this how Paris sets, we want to be 40% affordability of housing by 2035. When you know that's the target, you need to change back many things that are happening now. Because to me, the main challenge is always governance and how for Barcelona to building the larger, because all the solutions to housing affordability, to smart mobility are not within the boundaries of central Barcelona, they are beyond the boundaries. But the coordination is still, it has a lot of room for improvement. How do you do that? If you wait to have a elected mayor of over 160 municipalities, we will never get to the point. So I think the biggest innovation is how you try to be smart in how you plan and how you bring together across a common mission that basically we have the same challenges: climate change, housing affordability, inclusion, putting people at the center. But how do you do that without getting lost in analysis and data and just making the main points and everybody work in the same direction? So I think we are trying to innovate in this way of bringing people together towards one common objective.
Barbara, thank you very much. And I'll add a few reflections of my own in a minute. But just to say, thank you to the NLA hosts who've now reposted Stephen's chat to everyone so everyone can now see the links. So, of course, I agree with what's just been said by our rather brilliant panelists on what needs to be reinvented, and especially housing, inequality, climate, and Phil's comment in the chat about reinventing or reimagining parking. I really like. I'd like to add a few others. I think we need to reinvent how we use Fridays in our cities. Fridays are a kind of new thing now. We no longer have quite the delineation between the working week and the weekend, and Friday's becoming a kind of hybrid day. So I think that's interesting. I also think we could reinvent or reimagine time in our cities. The idea that we're locked into certain portions of the day being used for certain things is something that I think is becoming unlocked or unstuck. We could play with that a bit. I think Phil's comments earlier and Barbara's emphasize the need to reinvent the relationship between city centres and suburbs and town centres. I think that's really right. But I also think that there's a big agenda to reinvent the relationships between our cities and our rural areas that has become, I think, very strained and certainly very strained politically over the last period. And with all of that, I'm just going to say, firstly, thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today. We've really appreciated having you here. We appreciate our speakers. I want to say a special thank you to Barbara and Oyvind for joining us from Barcelona and from Oslo, and to Stephen and Phil for joining us from London, but sharing their expertise and their insights so great. In our first Cities Roundtable, we had British cities talking about the housing crisis. In our second roundtable today, we've had European cities talking about reimagining cities. In our third one on the 22nd of January at 6 p.m. UK time, we'll be joined by New York, Toronto, and Philadelphia to talk about place leadership in cities and how public and private and civic can work together to define our places. And then later in the year, we'll be joined by Tokyo, Singapore, and Hong Kong to talk about demonstrated districts, which are the districts in their cities which they think best exemplify the kind of change we want to see. So hopefully all of you will join us on the 22nd of January, 6 p.m. UK time. And our thanks once again to Philip, to Stephen, to Oyvind, and to Barbara, and to everybody at the NLA for today's event. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.